You are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Rootbound is brought to you by moss, making forests more magical, one non-vascular plant at a time.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for listening to this episode of Rootbound. I'm your host, Steve, and Rootbound is the podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside. Each week, I invite a guest who shares with me about a plant that means something to them, and then I share with a guest about a plant that means something to me, and through this process, we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. Listeners to the podcast will know, however, that fake bell sound means we're having a special episode where we're only going to talk about one plant. Now, traditionally, that's because the plant that the guest chose was on my secret list of plants, and so I have something to say about that plant as well. But that's not really the case today. I don't have a ton of experience with this plant, but it's something I'm really interested in, and I think as the show has evolved and we've done a lot of episodes, I want to open up the idea to have single plant episodes when there's a plant that's really interesting and the guest is really an expert on that plant. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we do, I have a little vocabulary. We haven't done any vocabulary for a little while. I want to talk about two words, and those words will come up later in the episode, so you'll know what they mean and have a better understanding when you hear them. It's words that I really didn't have in my head until recently. So those words are dioecious and monoecious, and these are two ways to classify plants, and it's pretty simple. A dioecious plant is a plant that has both male and female plants. So there's one plant that will have all the male flowers and one plant that will have all the female flowers. And you need both to, for the plant to reproduce. So for example, in my garden, I have Yaupon holly bushes. I talk about Yaupon holly in episode 5 of the podcast, but Yaupon holly is dioecious. There are male plants and female plants. And I happen to have 3 male plants and 1 female plant, which is pretty interesting. And you can tell it's a female plant because it's the one that gets berries. The female plant is the one that gets berries. The male plant does not. So that's what dioecious means. Monoecious means the plant has both male and female flowers on the same plant. And I think the most common example of this is that you might have seen is squash. So if you see squash blossoms, there's very clearly male squash blossoms that do not have the little fruit bulb at the back, and there are ones that do have the little baby squash at the back, and those are the female flowers. So the squash plant has both male and female flowers on the same plant, so they are therefore monoecious. So that's the definition of monoecious and dioecious, and with that, let's meet our guest and talk about our plant today, which is stinging nettle. Hi, Debbie. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Hi, Steve. Good to be here.
Do you have a plant to share with us today?
I have a plant. I'll be talking about stinging nettle.
Great. So before you continue, I have something to do that's very specific to this podcast, which I have to play this little sound effect, which hopefully you hear it well. That little dinging sound means that this is a special episode where we're only going to talk about one plant. Normally, the guest talks about a plant and I talk about a plant, but this episode, we're only going to talk about stinging nettle because it's a plant that I'm also very interested in. A little bit more aspirationally we can get into later. But first, I want to hear about why you chose it, why it's meaningful to you.
I like stinging nettle because it's a really nutritious plant. It's been used since ancient times for food and for other purposes. So it's very nutritious. It's good food. And I also like the way it bends itself. I like the fact that it has those stinging hairs. And I think it's amazing how they work. The plant is covered in these little hairs that kind of like hypodermic needles. And if you brush up against the plant, it injects chemicals into your skin. The hairs, they're called trichomes. And when something just gently brushes up against them, the tip of the hair breaks off. And it breaks at a sharp angle so that it's perfect to penetrate the skin. And at the base of this hair, there's a reservoir for stinging chemicals. And the entire hair is one cell. That's another thing that amazes me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the bulb at the bottom and this hair, and you can see them. They're not that small. The whole thing is one cell. And when something brushes up against the tip, it breaks off at that angle and forms like if you've ever seen the end of a hypodermic needle, it has that angle. It's just like that. And it
Oh, wow.
pierces the skin and injects these different chemicals. It has a combination of chemicals that cause pain and inflammation and welts on your skin. So I just think it's an amazing way for a plant to defend itself. When I start talking about stinging nettle, sometimes during programs, people will be like, "Why is she telling us about this plant? Who would want to put that into their mouth?"
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why is because once the plant is cooked, as soon as it's heated, those little stinging hairs are destroyed, and it just becomes a great cooked vegetable.
I always wondered exactly how that worked, and that makes a lot of sense because I had in my mind, in my little understanding of stinging nettle, that it is super nutritious, but it's also called stinging nettle.
Yeah.
But that makes it very clear that they just kind of go away when you heat it.
Yeah, when you heat it. And actually, like all you have to do is blanch the leaves for like a minute. And as
Oh,
soon as
wow.
the plant is wilted, like any green, like spinach or something would wilt, as soon as it's wilted, the hairs are destroyed and the sting goes away. And
Very
people
interesting.
also dry it and destroy the hairs by drying the plant. I'm told I haven't done that. And also just by physically destroying them, like putting the nettles into your bullet blender and destroying them that way.
Oh, wow. Well, that also
Yeah.
seems easy. Um,
Mm-hmm.
on the subject, I have a question that is important here, but on the subject of the chemicals, I was doing a little research actually just this morning about them, and my wife is
Yeah.
a chemist, so I kind of key into
Oh,
like
okay.
chemical names. Do you know what chemicals are in the stinger of a stinging nettle? This
Yeah.
blew me away.
I know. Yeah. One of them is formic acid, which
Yes.
is that's in the venom of like wasps and ants and
Mm-hmm.
bee stings. And another one is histamine, which causes pain
Yes.
but also causes inflammation. And acetylcholine. And I think there are a couple of
Yes.
others. Those are the three that come to mind.
The is histamine, the formic acid kind of made sense to me. I think a lot of plants use like an acid to like do pain, like a lot of oxalic
Mm-hmm.
acid based plants, right? Like the histamine and acetylcholine, which are human neurotransmitters as well, which is very interesting. The third one,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is one that most blew me away, is serotonin, which is
Serotonin,
very,
yes.
very
Yes.
serotonin, which is so
Mm-hmm.
amazing that this, and when you get when you get these in your skin, they cause it to itch, but these are things that actually actively work in your brain and in a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
different ways,
Yeah.
as you said. Histamine is immune
Right.
response, acetylcholine is neuromuscular signals, and then serotonin, everyone knows, is like the happy chemical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I
right,
was just blown
right.
away by that, like that it uses these neurotransmitters as its toxin, which yeah, I don't know, so cool. So on to a different topic. We were on the topic of the sting, and I just had to talk about that because it was like really blew me away this
Mm-hmm.
morning. But
Oh, yeah. No, it's pretty cool.
how do you collect them? Because sure you can boil the stingers away, but you have to get them to a pot
Yeah.
somehow.
Yeah. You have to. I always do it with my hand, with gloves on my hands. I always
Mm.
I always use gloves when I collect them. Rubber gloves. Some people do it barehanded,
Hmm.
uh, but I always wear rubber gloves. If you just grasp the leaf and you don't brush up against the plant, you can hold the leaf without it stinging you because those stinging hairs they're at an angle, like towards the tip of the leaf. And unless you rub the plant the wrong way, like against the grain, kind of like rubbing a cat against the grain, then you don't get stung. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you have to kind of like
So,
have some caution or some respect and knowledge before you can collect it without getting
yeah,
stung.
yes, it helps if you understand like how the hairs are on the leaf. So they're kind of angled at one in toward the tip of the leaf, and if you flatten them against the leaf, if you grab the leaf with your fingers and flatten those hairs, they don't get a chance to sting you. But if you just kind of gently brush up against those hairs and you're doing it in the wrong direction, then you'll get stung.
And what does the sting feel like? I'm assuming you've maybe been stung in the past?
Oh yeah, I've been stung. Um, sometimes people say it's burning and itching. I never experienced the itching part, but it's burning. It's like you got stung, maybe not as bad as getting stung by a bee, but a burning, stinging pain, and you can get welts. I certainly get welts, like on the inside of my wrist when I get stung, and redness. And it's not that awful, it goes away, but you know that you've been stung.
And I've read about some like folk remedies for this to like get to help the sting. Do you know anything about that? I don't
Yeah,
actually recall what some of those plants were.
yeah, yeah. So if you get stung, usually in the same location, you'll find plants like dock. You'll find dock growing. So uh, early dock or bitter dock. Early dock would be, they also call it yellow dock, Rumex crispus. And if you take those, and I know for a fact this works because I've done it several times, you just take the dock leaves and you crush them and rub it on the area, and the sting goes away. It really works. I know there's a lot of like anecdotes out there about that, but it really does work. So you have that, or you have the bitter or broadleaf dock. That works. And then also plantain, plantago, that's another
Oh yeah,
one that works. Yeah.
so cool. Apologies if you hear a cat meowing, Debbie and audience.
Oh,
My
that's
my one
okay.
cat really wanted to come in the room right now, and
That's
he's being
okay.
quite demanding. So yeah, that's really interesting that like the plants that grow nearby are kind of like the antidote to the
Yeah.
plant. That yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes you'll see that in nature, like poison ivy, and the antidote for that would be jewelweed, which very often grows near poison ivy.
Oh, cool. I'll
Very
remember that
interesting.
one.
Yeah.
I did
Oh,
an
yeah.
episode
Yeah.
where I talked about poison ivy, and maybe somewhat
Uh-huh.
foolishly, at the beginning of the episode, I exposed myself to poison ivy, but I
Oh.
did not have a reaction, and I
Oh,
don't know
yeah. Yeah.
whether it's just because I'm immune, which I know some people are, or whether that particular
Some
plant
people
was just
are.
not very
Yeah.
oily that day. But if I ever have it, I have learned how to identify jewelweed, and maybe I'll talk about it in a future episode.
Oh,
So
good.
that's a very good tip.
Oh,
So
yeah.
that's a cool plant
Yeah.
too.
It is. It's a beautiful plant. Yeah. And you would just take the stem of it and to release that sap and rub it on the area. And that does work too.
Wonderful. Oh, that's great tip.
Hmm.
Okay, well let's talk a little bit more about food. Like how would one
Yeah.
consume stinging nettle? What are some of your favorite ways to prepare it? Yeah, how do you eat
Okay.
it?
You'd harvest the tops of the plants, like the more tender tops of the plants, which you can get even like starting now. It's starting to come up now. So late winter into early spring. And you'd take the tops, maybe the first 2 or 3 sets of leaves with the tender stems. You'd bring them home, wash them off, and then expose them to some kind of heat. So I would usually blanch them in boiling water, and then take them out of the water, drain them, or remove the nettles from the water, squeeze them out, chop, 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 and then you have like cooked greens that you can use anywhere that you would use cooked greens, like cooked spinach. You could make pasta dish. You can do stinging nettle pizza. You could do stinging nettle quesadillas, or stinging nettle soup is good. Simple pot of soup, a little potato in there, and puree it up. So anywhere you would use greens, you could put it in scrambled eggs, or anywhere you'd use cooked greens, stinging nettles work.
And what is the flavor like?
It's very mild. It's a pleasant taste. Not all wild greens. Sometimes they can have a very earthy or funky taste or something. I find them very neutral. Like you're eating like mild cooked greens, and then you can flavor them however you like. Put them up in. I almost always start with olive oil and garlic, or garlic and onions, and make a simple side dish of stinging nettles with them. Just saute them up like that, and add a squeeze of lemon and maybe pepper flakes.
Sounds very good.
Yeah,
I
they're good.
so I'm gonna get back to the cooking and maybe collecting them, but just quickly to give you a little bit of my background and why I wanted to make this a special episode, even though I've never personally collected stinging nettle.
Oh, okay.
So as far as being a plant that is meaningful to me, I don't have that personal connection, but I have been kind of like personally interested in it for a long time, and I think it's that idea of like when you
Yeah.
hear about a stinging plant that you can eat, that's just a fascinating concept. Um, so
Yeah.
I've done a lot of reading, but I've never seen it around me. Maybe I'm just not looking right,
Oh,
and so maybe I'll get some tips on that
okay.
view. But I did recently. My wife and I were traveling in Europe, and we were in Liechtenstein, and I saw some actually like, right
Oh,
outside the castle of Liechtenstein, which is kind of a cool location. And I saw it, and I was very proud of
yeah.
myself that I was able to identify it, but I was not in position to collect it right then. But I do know it grow. It should grow. I live in the DC area. It should grow around here too, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. You want to look in moist areas, um, along streams or along paths, or I've found them everywhere along the edges of parking lots or whatever, moist areas, and like soil that's fairly rich, I think, but they're around.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go look for them. He,
Mm-hmm.
he- Here's another thing I was trying to read this morning about some interesting stuff about this plant, and the one thing that I came up, and I don't know if you don't know anything about this, it's okay. I always say it's fair that the audience can just Google it too, because nobody knows everything. But I was really fascinated by this idea that it's primarily known as a European plant, and there was some discussion
Right.
online that
Yeah.
it is spread around the world. But then there's also some talk
Mm-hmm.
that there is actually a Native American variety as
Yes,
well,
there
and I
is.
found it pretty interesting.
Yup. Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, there is a native stinging nettle. They call it, I think, California nettle or American stinging nettle, and it's native to the western United States, but now it's spread all over. And it's the name of it. The name of stinging nettle. Usually, if you look up stinging nettle, you'll see the name of it is Urtica dioica, and the native one was thought to be Urtica dioica subspecies gracilis. And now they're actually considering it a species in its own right, and it's our native stinging nettle, and it can be used interchangeably with the European ones, and sometimes it's even hard to tell them apart. I know around me here in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, pretty much all I'm seeing is the European species, but yeah, we do have native stinging nettles, and the people who are native to this, to United States, especially out west, native peoples made great use of stinging nettles for food, for clothing, use the fiber from the plant to make cordage, and
Have you ever used the nettle for like cordage or anything like that?
I haven't. No, I
Yeah,
haven't.
that's super interesting.
Really for
So
food. Yeah.
on the native stinging nettle, the thing I think I was only reading a little bit about this, so thank you for clarifying. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
The thing I thought was pretty interesting about it is, and when I first started learning it too, and kind of started getting interested in it, I heard it was this European plant that just spread all around the world. Which, like, there's a lot of things like that, right? You
Mm-hmm.
talked about plantago
Right.
earlier as one of those,
Mm-hmm.
but it's interesting how there's with a lot of stuff with plants, there's always this like European centric assumption about plants. And it's
Yeah.
like some
Yeah.
saw the nettle here at some point and said, oh, that of course is our nettle, and just never considered until recently that it was native.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, if you speak to native people here, they probably tell you for millennia that of course this is here from here. But it's just always interesting how the
Yeah.
history of a plant can be obscured by cultural context, and I thought that was really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Yeah. So it got here, who knows how long ago, and it
Yeah,
evolved here, and it evolved to become its own separate species, and it's considered native here.
very
And
interesting.
I find it interesting also that, like the word, scientific name, Urtica dioica, dioica means two houses, so
Huh.
like dioecious, the male and female flowers on separate plants. And they named it that because the European species are all dioecious, but the native one has evolved to be monoecious, where you have male and female flowers on one plant.
So fascinating. What a very interesting
Yeah.
plant. So
Mm-hmm.
late winter, early spring is the time to get them. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. And the
And
plants
bring
are small.
rubber
They still
gloves.
sting you, though. Yeah.
Okay.
And even though they're still very small, they will still sting you. And bring your gloves, bring good rubber gloves, And just so people know, if you don't have gloves and you try to use like a plastic bag over your hand, the stingers will go through the plastic bag. So I've done that.
Okay. So you're talking like doing the dishes rubber gloves, that kind of stuff will work?
Yeah.
Do you pluck it or do you use like a scissors, or how do you like separate the top
Yeah, I
from the
use
plant?
little snippers, little scissors. Yeah, yeah. And if I have forgotten my gloves, I will use the method where I grab the leaf with my fingers on one hand and then use the scissors with the other to clip off the top of the plant, and then just throw them in a bag, in a large, like a big paper bag. Yeah, you just want to make sure that while you're doing that, you're not accidentally brushing up against any of the nearby plants, because it's very easy to do that. But you'll know as soon as you do, you feel that thing.
How does it compare? I'm a beekeeper. How does it compare to a bee sting?
Oh, okay. I've been stung by different types of stinging insects, and it's not nearly as bad. And of course,
Good.
people experience it in different ways. So some people may tell you that it's that bad of a sting, but I don't think so. Not nearly as bad as a bee sting or a wasp. Yeah.
I guess you could get a lot more of it though, because there's more hairs than a single bee. But
That's true.
that's good to
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. No, it's not that awful. And a lot of people intentionally sting themselves for different reasons,
Oh, really?
to make sure that they've got the right plant sometimes for identification purposes. Sometimes people will, well, let me touch it. See, it looks like stinging nettles. Or you ever hear of urtification?
No.
That's an interesting one to Google. Urtification, where people intentionally expose themselves to stinging nettles to relieve pain, I think usually from arthritis. And that there's a long history of that too. People kind of like whipping themselves with stinging nettle plants. And it supposedly does work. And because I used to think, well, you're just like substituting one pain for another. But supposedly if you do that, if you rub stinging nettle onto arthritic joint, onto your knee or something, it stops the pain, and the pain is relieved even after the stinging from the nettles subsides. The pain still is relieved. So there's something in there that works.
I wonder if the serotonin and acetylcholine and histamine have any kind of action there. That's very fascinating. Very, very
right.
fascinating.
That's what I wonder. Yeah. Yep. Something in that combination there. Some of those chemicals are actually doing something.
Okay, I have one last kind of round of question, but maybe anything else you want to bring up. But I'm very curious about, you mentioned at the very beginning that it's very nutritious, and I wonder what you have to say about why is it nutritious?
Well, it contains a lot of things, a lot of like health promoting compounds in addition to vitamins. It's got a lot of vitamin A. I think in a half cup of cooked nettles, it gives you more than your daily requirement for vitamin A. A lot of potassium, a lot of calcium, iron, manganese, which is a good one. A lot of protein for a green plant, and rich in fiber, and a lot of antioxidants.
Wow, it's amazing. Oh, whoa.
Yeah. And I was reading one research about making tea, or I guess what they would call a water extract of fresh stinging nettles, and they found the optimal sting method is 10 minutes at 140 degrees. That leaves you with the most antioxidant activity.
Just a little tepid tea for the most powerful antioxidant.
Kind of, if you want to get the most from it. Yeah.
Fascinating.
But I remember that research article. They mentioned that the antioxidant activity in the stinging nettle tea was greater than that of vitamin E, which is a well-known antioxidant, and quercetin, and also BHA and BHT, those synthetic antioxidants, that it was more powerful than them. So
wow.
Maybe isn't that cool? So
yeah, super cool.
Stinging nettle tea or stinging nettle, as a potential natural antioxidant, so you don't have to use so much of these questionable synthetic food preservatives.
Yeah, very fascinating. I wonder if you can think about, I was explaining how I have this kind of fascination with it, and I've never really seen it. I wonder if you could tell me about when maybe you first learned about it.
Yeah, I remember when I was first stung, and it was like, oh yes, this is stinging nettle. But yeah,
Tell me
One
more
thing
about that.
is about when I got first stung. Well, actually, and it was interesting because I brushed up against the leaf with my finger, and it really stung. It was really a hot, burning sting, and I felt it until the next day, which I think is kind of unusual. I don't think people usually feel the effects of stinging nettle for that long. And the first joint of my finger, like I could feel it. It felt like almost like in the joint. Wow.
Very interesting. And you were going to say something else about something else about gathering it.
Oh, well, what I think is interesting is sometimes I can tell where a stinging nettle patch is just by the smell.
Oh.
And yeah, I know it's going to sound weird. It smells like cat pee. And I hate to say that because I don't want to turn people off to this plant because it's a wonderful plant, but it smells like cat urine. Am I allowed to say the word pee?
Yeah, of course.
It smells like cat urine.
Uh-huh.
And I can tell sometimes when I'm coming close to a patch of stinging nettles. I can smell that cat urine smell. And it's not just in my head either because my husband smells it as well. And I tried Googling that to see, if other people described it like that. And there are only a couple of references I could find to that kind of like smell of stinging nettles. Yeah, but it is odd. I can even, like, if I had a bag full of them in the car, even if it's in the trunk. I remember having a big open paper bag of stinging nettle tops, and it was in the trunk of the car, and I could actually smell it in the passenger compartment. So it's
Oh,
a
wow.
distinct smell, which goes away. The smell goes away, like when you cook it. But still, I could smell it in my kitchen. And it wasn't just from one location. So I know that that's a thing. It's not just, like, well, for some weird reason, like the nettles from this place over here smell bad. It's a thing.
Very interesting. I
Yeah, it's
I
odd.
it's a little bit similar, and I haven't had many experiences like that. I'm definitely like a very inexperienced forager, but the experience I had like that is with pawpaws, where you can tell it's much more strong,
Oh,
I guess, and
yeah.
very clear,
Oh,
but you can
yeah.
tell that you're getting
Uh-huh.
close to them, and when they're ripe, it's very in your face
Mm-hmm.
smell.
Yep. When there are enough ripe ones on the ground, yeah, you can definitely smell a pawpaw patch. Yeah, that's a more pleasant smell, though, than
Indeed, indeed,
even if they're kind of fermented. Yep.
indeed. Well, did we before we sign off? Did we miss any fun facts or dazzling details about stinging nettle?
Let's see, what else about stinging nettle? Used to be used as a fiber, like a textile. I think they say it's stinging nettle is the oldest known fiber textile used for clothing. They'd use it for like
Whoa.
clothing and cordage and making fishing nets and stuff. Yeah, in Europe. And it was, a really important textile material, along with flax and hemp. That is pretty cool, I think. What else? I always talk about poison ivy, not poison ivy. I like to talk about, when I do programs, I talk about stinging nettle lookalike plants. And there's another stinging plant out there called wood nettle, which is also edible. So if you make the mistake, it's not a problem. But wood nettle also has stinging hairs. And there's another lookalike called clearweed, which doesn't really look so much like stinging nettle. It's kind of, the plant is kind of translucent, and it has no hairs on it. So clearweed is another, some people think is a lookalike. And then there's false nettle. False nettle really looks like stinging nettle, but it has no stinging hairs. And then there's white snakeroot, and that's the only one that I know of to be concerned about in terms of toxicity, because white snakeroot can look like stinging nettle, but it doesn't have the stinging hairs. Wouldn't want to get it mixed up with that one. If you got it mixed up with that one, that's not good.
That's when you might want to
Just
try
check for the.
stinging yourself.
Yeah,
If
exactly.
you're
You
not
do
sure.
that
Yeah.
crash course and say, "Yep, let me touch it," and I'll know. Yeah, you always want to check for those stinging hairs. If you're not sure, you don't eat it. And snake root doesn't have stinging hairs. That's the plant that killed Abraham Lincoln's mother. You know that story?
No.
Oh, okay. You want to
Please
Google
do
that because
tell.
you're
Yeah.
into plants.
I
Yeah.
I would love to hear if you've
Snake
got
root.
I'd love to hear a quick version of that if you have. That sounds fascinating.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Snake root, white snake root. They say it's the plant that killed Abraham Lincoln's mother. So back in those days, a lot of people were dying from something called milk sickness. And a long story short, the cows were eating white snake root, and the poison was going into their milk. And then people would drink the milk,
Whoa.
affected by it. Yeah, and it supposedly killed a lot of people, including Abraham Lincoln's mother.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
I wonder, diagnosing that issue back in those days must have been really a real
Yeah,
mystery.
exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it actually was, I think it was a female doctor who finally understood what was going on and figured out, don't let your cows eat white snake root.
Very interesting.
So don't get white snake root mixed up with stinging nettle.
The stinging nettle only will still be found to stand, the numberless, the lonely, the thronger of the land, the leaf that hurts the hand, that thrives come sun, come showers, blow east, blow west, it springs. It peoples towns and towers above the courts of kings, and touch it and it stings. The Stinging Nettle by A.E. Housman.
Stinging nettle. I really can't wait to go out and try to harvest some stinging nettle of my own. And I'm really thankful to Debbie for sharing her knowledge about the plant. And I think I feel more confident in going out and finding it on my own. But with that, before we go, just a little disclaimer, and we say this on every episode we talk about foraging, is do so at your own risk and responsibility. It's up to you to be sure about what plant you're going to gather from the wild and eat, because sometimes it can be dangerous. As Debbie said, the plant white snake root, which can look like stinging nettle, is quite poisonous, and so you have to be very careful, and Rootbound has no responsibility for that. This is all up to you to be responsible for how you gather anything from the wild. It's not just for safety, but it's also for respect. You don't want to overgather things. We talked about that in a previous episode as well. So be responsible, be safe before you forage any wild plant. And on that topic, I got a little email from Debbie after the show with some information regarding safety. And Debbie says, I always tell people to learn as much as they can about a plant until they feel comfortable using it and to cross-check multiple reliable sources. Also, if they have any medical conditions, sometimes this needs to be considered. With stinging nettle, I advise that the use of nettles during pregnancy is controversial, so it's best to avoid. So there's a little bit of advice about stinging nettle from Debbie, and everyone just be safe, be responsible, and thanks for listening. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Debbie Naha-Koretsky. Debbie is a foraging instructor, licensed dietitian/nutritionist, Rutgers Master Gardener, Pennsylvania Master Naturalist, and expert in wild edible plants. You can learn more about Debbie at her website, which is wildediblesnjpa.com. That's New Jersey, Pennsylvania. If you like Rootbound and you want to help support the show, visit rootboundpodcast.com/support and find all the ways you can support the show, including just telling a friend. Rootbound is hosted by Stinging Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegescota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside and you plan on picking some stinging nettle, don't forget to bring your rubber gloves.
Making forests more magical, one non-vascular plant at a time. Moss.